Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thank you for joining us. Today, my guest is Adaurennaya Onyewuenyi, who is an assistant professor of psychology at the College of New Jersey, which I'll probably default to TCNJ with your permission. Thanks for being here today, Ada.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we jump into our topic of the day, I always ask our guests to set some context. Can you tell a little bit about you and your training, what you teach there, people that don't know the College of New Jersey, or maybe they're from farther back in history and they still call it Trenton State. What can you tell us, please?
Yeah, so I guess about myself. So first gen college student from undergrad all the way up through PhD, child of Nigerian immigrants of the Igbo tribe, Black fat woman. I am Cali born and raised. So sun and burritos are definitely things that I enjoy a lot. And I got my PhD from the University of Washington in educational psychology and more specifically in human development and learning sciences, and began my assistant professorship in psychology at the College of New Jersey in the psych department, in addition to being an affiliate faculty member in the African American Studies department. I like to say like TCNJ is very much like the quintessential like East Coast, New England, small liberal arts kind of institution for folks that like, I don't know if you've seen like movies or TV shows, that's kind of the vibe here. So definitely on the smaller end, which is really cool, especially as someone who's went only to like big schools. So I went to UC Davis for undergrad and UW for UW, not to be confused with UW. For Wisconsin folks. So I've only been to like really big R1 institutions. So definitely on the smaller side here, the psych department is probably over 650 undergraduate students. Students get the opportunity to do research with us, which is really, I think, one of the coolest hallmarks of TCNJ. We have over 19 research labs, and on average, we have probably 7 to 15 students per lab. I tend to teach classes at the intersection of both education and psychology. So I teach development across the lifespan, racial and ethnic identity development. And in the fall, I introduced a new course, Black psychology. And I have a research lab, which is focused on identity development across the African diaspora, which I focus on the racial ethnic identity construction, the impacts of racial discrimination on the academic achievement and mental health outcomes of Black American, African immigrant, Caribbean immigrant, Afro-Latinx teens and young adults.
Terrific. There's so much we could talk about with that. And selfishly, there's so much you know that I do not know. So, but why I called you for this podcast was because I read an essay that you wrote that really spoke to me as someone that has tried to increase dramatically and rapidly their own work in the classroom around equity issues. And you were encouraging some nuance that I think not everyone thinks about all the time. So without wanting to put words in your mouth, can you maybe talk a little bit about what you wrote about, how you're thinking about it now, and what faculty should be doing if they want to create truly inclusive classrooms, not checking a box?
Yeah, this was such a fun piece of work to write, a really cool way. So I was invited by the Character Lab, which is run by, spacing.
I'm a memory researcher, Angela Duckworth.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And
Angela
listeners
Duckworth
should know this didn't just come out last week. It took us a little while to get to
Yeah.
Together,
It was so about 2 years ago. Black History Month 2 years ago. And so invited to write a piece about the Black immigrant experience, and most specifically thinking about Black immigrant experience and immigrant experiences more broadly in the K through 12 sector, because that's where a good set of my research is focused on, especially on adolescents. And so some of that is, some of what I wrote about was to acknowledge like the cultural frameworks that folks have, educators, as well as their students, having an understanding that like what you see or the categorizations, the racial categorizations you might be placing your students in may not be all of who they are. So like I open with talking about like I'm perceived as Black, and I am Black, and I'm proudly Black, and I'm also Nigerian. And so as an immigrant, the ways in which that has interacted with things in my educational experience and others' educational experiences that are very different, but some teachers don't always take that into account. And so thinking about the different kind of asset perspectives to take, especially with immigrant populations and even other racially minoritized populations. So really trying to think forth about the things that your students, the knowledge bases that they have from their communities, from their cultures, that could be really beneficial in the classroom, and how to include that in there, but also for teachers and educators to position themselves as somebody with a culture, with a history, and sharing with your students too. So having that level of vulnerability with your students, but also with their, especially in the K through 12 sector, thinking about with their families, right? So trying to think through in what ways am I making sure that the text that I'm using or activities and examples that I'm using reflects the lived experiences of the students in my classroom, and in what ways may I like broker language brokering? So this idea of kind of immigrant students, immigrant kids, being the translator between their families and any services, and in what ways can we be cultural brokers with our students too, and using that as a kind of from an asset-based framework as well.
Terrific. Thank you. And yes, it is. It's a great piece. So maybe I'll figure out if there's an archive that we can link to in the show notes for people that read it 2 years ago and have forgotten or missed it the first time around.
Yeah.
So thinking practically, then if we can sort of talk specifically about your classrooms, can you give some examples of what you do for this? And then recognizing that this, may not be something you have a quick answer to, maybe thinking about how that should or shouldn't look different based on your own identity markers, right? So I am not a proud Black woman. I am a conscientious and concerned white woman. But those certainly, have absorbed my white Midwestern culture for sure. So do you have thoughts about how to do this in a way that can help some students, not all, make the classroom work well? Like, how do I sort of think about how what you said works for me versus how it works for you versus who's in the classroom? Again, there's infinite combinations of how this could look, but how do I make sure that I guess it boils down to that I'm doing so with the right amount of sensitivity and care, and recognizing maybe that it'll take my students longer to warm up than they might for someone with whom they share an overlapping identity.
Mm-hmm. I always say to my students, right, this idea that like not all skin folk are kinfolk. Just because we share particular social locations or identities doesn't necessarily mean that I understand my students' perspective, right? Again, in this way that like, yes, I'm perceived as a Black person, but there's ways in which growing up, right, I had or I actually didn't have that many Black educators until I was in college, but in ways in which the cultural framing of Blackness that folks have is still Black American. And so can still be mismatch. And so we have to like check ourselves. We're human. This is part and parcel of like conditioning, evolutionary biology, all of these things out of survival that like we have to sort and stratify and like sort and categorize things to figure out safety and all of these things. But then how we've translated that into these kind of social contexts is very different. So in thinking through what is it that I think about in the classroom and what is it that I do in the classroom, is that sometimes I often actually start the classroom by talking about how the push for inclusivity means that we're oftentimes recentering whiteness. And so in higher education, that's already born and bred and regurgitates white supremacy and white supremacist notions. How am I trying to make a classroom space that's antithetical to that, which means we're decentering whiteness? It means centering the voices, especially in psych, that are considered to be on the margins or least likely to be considered as knowledgeable, as valid, as sound. And so that means that I have students constantly kind of rethinking that. And so ways in which we engage with that is like our articles that we might be reading. If we're reading a book or research articles and seminars, I make sure to provide each lecture the actual physical picture of the researcher and their name and their institution and a little bit about them. So that way students can put a face to these folks that they're reading, and understanding that, of course, like we have perceptions of what it is that we're seeing of this person in their social locations, and how that then informs how we make sense of our interpretation of what it is that we're reading. So naming that. Another thing that I do in my classroom setting is every month is a heritage month of some sort, right? So at the beginning of the semester, the beginning of every class, actually, like, for example, we're in Black History Month, March will be Women's History Month, April, May, Filipino, Asian, API. So I feature influential psychologists in those fields, folks that are from the assistant to the associate to the full professor. So students can have a better understanding of, like, there are folks that look like you, that might have these social locations, that might be exploring these type of research questions, that might be of interest for you to read their work. Sometimes it is folks that we're reading. Sometimes it's folks that we're not reading, but so that way they know that these people exist, that they might want to pursue if they want to think about graduate school or research. Practicing the ways to be critical about the work and bringing in other people's work that counteracts the white canon of psychology, and calling that out to my students persistently, right? So like in my Development Across the Lifespan book class, the book, I always say, this book was written by an old white dude. And so there's ways in which the framing of things is from an old white man's perspective. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just there might be a different way because of our social locations that we might interpret those particular findings, right? Or those particular perspectives. And so how might my social location shape that, and how then I articulate that to my students, right? Like, psychology is known as focusing on the individual, but really a lot of psychologists look at systems. So in what ways are we seeing white supremacy manifested in policies that impact development? In what ways do we think about issues around the Black maternal health issue as systematic, structural, institutional things that isn't about the individual failing of Black individuals or the Black community? And so really trying to aid them in the things that they're already thinking about, right? The beauty of Gen Z and Gen Alpha is that they're already engaged in these kinds of things. So how are we bringing that into the classroom? How are we bringing more recent scholars into conversation with the canon that already exists and show students how do we critique? It lays the foundation of, right, this old stuff, seminal works, lay the foundation for our fields, but it's not the whole thing. And even then, when we talk about things like methodology, right, like I'm purposeful that, psych again is really erring or focused on being seen as a science, a valid science with a capital S. And for some folks, that's fine. But that's not the only way to do work. And so bringing in different methodological traditions and how that ties to the types of questions that we're asking, who we're centering, what's seen as valid data that's outside of quantitative. So bringing in conversations of qualitative and mixed methodological work, as ways to show these are different ways of doing science, of doing research that answers these questions that might be of real interest to you. But because you've been so used to seeing how white-centered psych is, you may not know that this kind of stuff exists.
Great. And maybe I will ask and it's fine if you want to send me things for the show notes.
Yeah.
For those of us that are late to realizing that your obsession with the t-test may come at a cost for things, do you have a recommendation for a good starter qualitative mixed methods reader? Because I've realized I've been collecting qualitative data, like with answers to essay test questions that are probably full of things. I don't just want to just re-quantify them. Do you have a good first read for our listeners that might be like, oh, maybe I'm willing to branch out a little?
Yeah. So I'm going to say something to a point that you had raised, like it's totally fine to quantify qualitative data. It's in conversation with how we quantify it, right? So if it's numerically doing how often a particular phrase or how this phrase is, and then what that phrase is, and trying to extrapolate the explanation of that phrase and using the cultural frame, that's a way in which we marry both the quantitative and the qualitative together. In terms of like some more traditional, like most of the stuff within my beginner's realm of qual work and qualitative work has been around folks like Patton and Miriam. Last name is Miriam, citation Miriam 2009. They're white scholars. Anthropologists really are the foundation of thinking about qual work, especially ethnography. But there's a lot of critical scholars. Each of our subfields have critical qualitative researchers, right? So like within Ed Psych, all the folks within Ed Psych and Ed more broadly who do qual work using narrative kinds of methodologies, casework, ethnography, I'll have to send some stuff because I'm blanking right now. And then in terms of mixed methods work, Plano and Creswell are some other folks. And they're like methodologists. So they think about their focus, their realm is within mixed methods work. And they have lots of discussions about quantitative work, qualitative work, the traditions within those things, the ways in which we frame the questions, and making sure to have the conversation between our question generation and how that then matches to the types of data we're collecting. And then that also shapes how we're analyzing said data. And then I've been working with some colleagues, Dan Schaefer at University of Wisconsin-Madison, using some new methods called quantitative ethnography, which is in really cool ways. It does statistical analysis and data visualization of qualitative data. So if it would like systematically analyze the codes that you've created, and you're able to create these really cool data visualizations, p-values, you can run regressions on the frequencies of the types of phrases that are used, the relationships between the particular codes that you have. For example, if you were to have subgroups, what are the similarities and differences in the data visualization of these codes for our Black population, our Indigenous student population, and our white population? Are they using the same kinds of words? Does this data visualization look different? Are the p-values and the regressions that we're running on those things look different? And so marrying both that quantitative and that qualitative together. Yeah.
Sounds great. Makes me want a sabbatical just to go.
Yeah, they're doing some really, really cool stuff at Wisconsin with this quantitative ethnography. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to be mindful of our, sort of standard show length time, but I do always like to leave space, recognizing that, like I said at the beginning, you know so much I don't know. So is there something else that you would had wanted to share or want to tell our listeners about that you think could help us be better teachers?
Yeah, I guess when we think about, the question that you had asked earlier, like things that I do in the classroom, and then trying to think about how would that change as a function of one's social location, right? It's acknowledging that we have social locations. Our identities shape the content and our delivery of that content, the things that we're putting on our syllabus, how we're engaging with it. And so being frank with your students, right? Like, also acknowledging that our students have a wealth of knowledge. Again, they're engaging in some of these more critical conversations in various different ways, that the power differential is what power tied to the fear of not knowing or of messing up. We're not supposed to be perfect. We have become educators because we're wanting to aid the next generation, but it also means that we also know the next generation will be ahead of us, and they're supposed to be. So being open to that and being frank, especially with college students, even with high school students. I feel like even with K through 12, I do this like with my 6-year-old niece, right? Ways in which that I'm like, oh, Auntie doesn't know that. I'm really sorry. Let's go look into this together and we can try and figure that out, right? That the humility and the vulnerability, when you do that, it shapes something different in that classroom environment space, especially for the students who feel so marginalized, who feel as if though their voices and perspectives are not seen as valid. And so really trying to think through the ways in which you might be taking up space, that your perspective might be taking up space, and who it might be alienating, who is least likely to even be registering for your courses, because students talk. Right? Students talk. They know which classes engage with these types of topics, which ones don't. Even in our subfields that are less likely to have these kinds of conversations, how do we then draw from other subfields of psychology or other fields to help supplement our engagement with these conversations, right? So, one of my really great friends in grad school, anthropologists, looking at fMRIs as well, but trying to figure out the best versions of the CAPS for Black folk, right? And that we do just need to construct new stuff. We can actually measure this stuff for different types of hair types, but because our fields, medicine, cog, psych, biopsych, have been so focused on this particular population, they're not willing to look outside the box. But folks in anthropology have been having this conversation and developing new tools. So how do we bring that kind of information or knowledge base into our classrooms as well? So really trying to push ourselves outside of our silos, which is hard. And just having humility and acknowledging with your students that, like, I don't know everything, and nor should I. And I'm going to learn some stuff from you. And, you know, I like to say, like, we're co-creators of this learning environment. That means I have to dissuade some of that power in that space. And that can really shift something for a number of students.
Terrific. I'm in. And I wish you would have been in my class yesterday, because I felt like you could have pushed me even further when we were talking about, you know, the second research methods chapter about why science could be better than our intuition. And I did go on a side tangent about how we're not as objective as we might think we are. And as I was trained to believe we were, right? That, you know, as long as you controlled the variables, that you were making an unbiased judgment. I now realize that, guess that was wrong. But still worth thinking about the methodology, as long as we recognize that it's not the perfect answer.
Yeah. It's also, like I tell students, numbers are numbers. It's our interpretation of those numbers, and everybody is going to interpret those numbers differently.
Well, fabulous. This was such a good chat, and maybe you'll be one of those people I have come back again, because I feel like you'll be able to solve other problems that I don't know that I have yet.
I am more than welcome.
You're just down the highway for me, but then if we record it, then others can be helped.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time today. Take care.
You too.
My guest today was Dr. Adaurennaya Onyewuenyi from the College of New Jersey. Listeners, did today's episode make you realize you have a question you would like someone to answer? I would be happy to take it into consideration and find a guest that can help. But what I need you to do is head over to our Google form at bit.ly/AskPsychSessions.